Hi, ThatPaulGuy. Today's building blocks is going to have to do with some of the confusing nomenclature that's out there. Things like megahertz, gigahertz, terabytes, and so forth. And so that's what we're going to do, third in a series of building blocks, but I'm going to have to split this one up. This one's actually going to be probably a two-parter. So here we go. Okay, so the first thing we probably need to define is what when we hear terms like megabytes and gigabytes and megahertz and terabytes and stuff like that, it can get really confusing. But basically, we're going to try to break it down to a couple of simple things. A bit and a byte. Those are the first two things we're going to tackle. A bit is one small piece of information. It's a 1 or a 0. It's an on or an off. It's a yes or a no. A byte is 8 of those. And you can think of it maybe as a letter and a word. And everything that your computer does has to be, it does that by a series of 1s and 0s, or on and off, or yes and no. And depending on the speed of your computer, the speed of the memory, the speed of the video card, all of that stuff is very dependent on how fast your computer can manipulate those 1s and 0s. So commonly you'll hear things called bytes or megabytes or things of that nature. Sometimes you'll hear it be called bits. Now from your cable company, typically you're going to hear something like, your download speeds are 40 megabits per second. That's the small ones. You have to remember that. That's small ones. If you're trying to convert that to megabytes, you have to divide that by 8. So typically, when somebody says you're downloading at about 40 or 50 megabits per second, that's usually good for streaming with one device, maybe video games, that type of thing. It's very good if you have 1 or maybe 2 users. The reason why cable companies now are going 400, 500 megabytes, a gigabyte, is because you're now talking about having several devices hooked up. So you might have a tablet, your phone, a game system. Somebody might be streaming Netflix and all that stuff. And even though each one of those devices only uses 30, 40, 50 megabytes, all those devices together need more bandwidth. And bandwidth is the reason why it can push more of a signal across in one time. So a bit is one small piece of information. It's a yes or no, a 1 or a 0. The byte is 8 of those, so you can think of it like a word. And then the frequency that something travels or something is processed is how many times those things are processed in 1 second. So if you have 1 hertz, that means you have 1 set of operations per second. If you've ever heard of a hum coming from, say, I don't know, maybe a toaster or your microwave or maybe your game system or something, you hear that low type hum, that's typically referred to as a 60 hertz hum. And that's usually because something might not be grounded properly or something has gotten loose in the power supply and it makes that noise. You can physically hear that, and that means that there's 60 cycles per second. You can actually hear that. So if you think of megahertz, that's millions of cycles. And that's where we usually talk about getting into things that are like broadcast television, radio signals, and things like that. So if you're operating gigahertz, it's even faster than that. And each one of the computer can operate at a certain number of operations per cycle. And then you multiply that by times how many cycles are in that, say megahertz, gigahertz, or however. Memory works at different speeds that your CPU does, which operates at different speeds than your GPU, and so we'll cover a couple of those just to kind of clear some of that up. Storage devices like hard drives, they will store things in gigabytes or now terabytes, and in some cases you might have petabytes. Well, as you can figure, you multiply that times 1,000 each time one of those major names comes up. Megabyte, gigabyte, terabyte, what have you. It's 1,000 times bigger or faster than the one before you. So for right now, we're just trying to break it down and make it simple to try to figure out. We'll go over some of those things like the CPU or memory and how those things work in the next video. But for right now, I just kind of wanted to break it down a little bit. Like I said, the easiest example to think of is your cable company. When you download speeds through, say, your Wi-Fi or when you're hooking up your cable, the data that's coming from them, typically for one user or say the base package, you might have anywhere from 30 to 50 megabits, and that's fine for a limited number of devices. Say you've got a phone that's streaming, or you've got a tablet or something like that, or maybe a game system that you're playing on. But the more devices you have, the more bandwidth you need to be able to handle those devices and that signal passing back and forth. So that's kind of the way you can think about that. Megabits, a bit is just one thing. A megabit is a million of those, which sounds like a lot until you start thinking about how complicated electronics are nowadays. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Like I said, I'm going to have to break these up a little bit so we can kind of cover that. But for right now, we're going to think of a bit being one letter in a word, and a byte being a word that's, say, eight pieces long. It's simple. It's an on or an off. It's a yes or no. It's a 1 or a 0. And your entire computer operates on that premise. So next time we'll dig a little bit deeper into what some of those things like TeraBytes or GigaHertz or whatever mean in your computer itself. But I wanted to start out with something a little bit more basic so we can understand where we're coming from in the first place. So I hope that helps. Like I said, I'm going to break it up a little bit. I want to make it where it can be understood. But I definitely will definitely get back on this. Maybe in a couple of days. We might put this off till next week, depending on how we get this formatted. But I wanted to make sure I got this one posted tonight. Clark, you're welcome. I still don't have anything on my wall behind me. Sorry. For everybody else, you're welcome to hit that red subscribe button. Always feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down, however you want to put it, and feedback is always welcome. And next time we're going to explore some of the frequencies that are actually in your computer and what they do and how that operates. So until then, folks, have a good night, and we'll talk to you next time.